Have you ever known anyone to say they weren't going to have kids because they didn't want to bring them into this world? That they found the world too harsh, the future too unpredictable, everything too scary? I've known people who have struggled with that. We actually had a friend who suggested it was selfish of us to have a third child. This when I was pregnant with said third child. We're still friends. That comment, too, came out of a certain understanding of the world, that the earth can't carry all these people, that the future is dire, and that there are many children already here in need of loving families. Now, truth be told, had we started having children when we were younger, I would have even had more than 3. But now that I am even older, I think I understand some of that concern and fear when I think about what the world might be like for our boys. Certainly, there are the reports that for the first time in ages, our children or grandchildren will not have the same lifestyle that we have had. I most feel afraid when I read the truth about what is happening to the environment and how it will not be able to sustain life. And then I think of our kids and their kids if they choose to have them, and your kids and the world's kids. But today's lesson begins in the days of King Herod, which means in the time of the Roman Empire, when people like Zechariah and Elizabeth had no power whatsoever and no means or ways to climb up an economic or social ladder. Rome controlled everything. It was a constant presence. I imagine it felt like a great weight, like what I experienced in the summer of 1981 when I went to the Soviet Union. I thought there was a lot of fear-mongering in those days about communists. My one history professor would show these movies that were really frightening, and I would call them almost propaganda films. But I guess if you're Ukraine now, you'd say there's nothing propaganda about it. When we were in the Soviet Union, we experienced our phones bugged, our travel limited to prescribed areas. I have to say that the weight of that empire could be felt. It was heavy, it was oppressive. I didn't want to feel that way, but I did. And when we got on the plane and it lifted up out of Soviet airspace, the whole plane cheered. We felt the weight lifted. It felt like freedom. Now imagine if that is your daily, yearly, forever existence, as it was for Zechariah and Elizabeth. This was an empire that existed by controlling people. It was, as all empires are, about expansion, taking over other countries, and enriching itself at their expense. And there were different ways to respond to this reality. King Herod, who like Zechariah and Elizabeth was Jewish, decided to figure out how to work the system for his benefit. He had family connections, so he went to Rome to wheel and deal, and he got the support of Mark Antony and Octavian to get the Roman Senate to vote for him to be king of Judea, which they did. And then, with the help of the Roman military, he took control of Judea, and from the vote in the year 40 BCE to his death in 4 CE, he killed whomever might challenge him, including his wife, 2 of their sons, a brother-in-law, his wife's mother, and his wife's grandfather. And some of us thought there was tension around our Thanksgiving dinner tables. This is the world Zechariah and Elizabeth lived in. Oppressive, violent, a world where many, I imagine, tried to keep a low profile, not wanting to set Herod off, knowing how brutal he could be against protesters and in collecting taxes for his projects. Nothing new there. People empowered taking care of their own and disregarding the lives and fears and needs of the majority. But here is what does seem new. Into this world, one in which there was plenty to fear about their own survival, let alone bringing any children into it, Zechariah and Elizabeth have been praying for just that. They have been praying for a child. And today we hear that their prayer is answered. Now, what's amazing to me is nowhere before this angel shows up do we hear that Zechariah and Elizabeth were afraid. There's plenty to fear, but we never hear that they are afraid. All we know is that they were righteous before God, meaning living rightly despite all the corruption and violence around them, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. Zechariah is a priest who took his turn serving in the temple. Elizabeth is descended from Moses' brother Aaron's daughters. Aaron was the first high priest appointed by God. So talk about having some family connections, very different from Herod's, and used for a different purpose, used for faithfulness and righteousness for the sake of the community, not themselves. Oppression was a constant presence, but Zechariah and Elizabeth lived responding not to that presence, but to the constant presence of God. So, why did Zechariah become afraid when this constant presence, the one he has been praying to, the one whom he has been worshiping his whole life, shows up? The first time we hear that he's afraid is when God shows up. Well, first of all, I wonder if it's because Zechariah knew that God, even all signs sometimes to the contrary, is more powerful than any of the empires or the Herods we might fear. Whoa, the mighty one has shown up. And second of all, I wonder if it's because Zechariah knew, whoa, my life's going to change now. That something would be asked, demanded of him, even at his advanced age. So that's what's true about faith. We never arrive. We never get to retire. Those of you who are older, we never get to retire from faith, contrary to what some elders sometimes say. It's time for the next generation to take over. Maybe doing some church stuff, to be sure, but not the heart of church stuff, which is living out our faith in word and deed. We don't get a pass because we've been faithful. It's actually more the opposite, which I sometimes find so unfair. I've lived through a lot in my life. I should just be able to rest on that, right? But it's the opposite with faith. The more we step out in faith, the deeper we go in faith, the more that is asked of us. I'm thinking Zechariah and Elizabeth had made peace with their not having a child. I imagine they were content with the life they had been given. They had lived it faithfully, not in bitterness. And then God shows up very late to the party and asks them to do a new thing, to be the ones who give birth and raise the one who will prepare the way for God. And maybe that's a different way of thinking about bringing children into this world, either then or now. We bring or raise children up in the world to prepare the way for God, to offer people hope, not fear, to speak out for justice, to be kind and generous, to care rather than exploit the earth, to remind one another in the world that though empires and Herod-type rulers and fear exist, so does our God. So does our God, who is not far away, but who has come near and to stay in Jesus, reminding us that with God by our side, we have nothing to fear. And the world needs people with the hope and the courage to proclaim just that. Jesus needs people to proclaim just that. In his name, amen.